conservation and development of water and related resources, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment, call up Coburn Amendment 815.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment numbered 815.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment and call up amendment number 816.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment numbered 816.
I ask the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
I have a question for the chairman through the chair, if I might. My question on the deauthorizing commission would be, why would they not take into consideration all of the things that you just mentioned before they would recommend deauthorizing a program, if in fact the only reason they wouldn't deauthorize it was it's spending money that's not going to have a positive purpose? And so my question is you trust the deauthorizing committee for all these other areas, but you don't trust their judgment to look at projects that are ongoing, that have a private, why would we think that they wouldn't make a positive decision in the best interest of the country?
I would answer my friend in this way. This is a new commission. We set it up in the bill. It's never worked before. We don't know how it will work. So we thought, for starters, let's go after the older projects, see how it works, and any day we could come back and add more authority. But we think if there are active projects, it sends a very confusing signal to the folks back home, and we think this is the way to start it. It's smart. We've never had this commission before. I'm very proud that we have it in here. I know my colleague supports the commission. He's already wanting to expand it. But I think you start this way, and then if it looks like we can give them more authority, we can. By the way, any day of the week, Congress could deauthorize as well.
The point I'd make, Mr. President, is the following. The big problem with WRDA bills is they become parochial in nature. And so what we have excluded is everything since 1996 forward, which actually includes the present members of Congress in terms of projects, their parochial wishes. So what we've done is we've said you may not be required or capable of defunding or deauthorizing something else, but if it's new, you don't have the opportunity to do that. So what we're doing, we're protecting the ends. I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, I really respect my friend, and I know that his intention is the best. But I do have to say, there is not one earmark in this bill. He should be so proud of both sides of the aisle here in this committee. Not one earmark. And we don't tell the commission what they can and cannot do, but we do set some parameters. Because we do believe, as we start this deauthorization commission, it ought to go after the older projects, but projects that are active, let them get a chance to move forward. And there's no earmarks in this bill. I kind of resent it in a nice way. I'm not angry about it, but believe me, there's no intention to protect earmarks here at all. So I hope we'll vote no. I think we are starting something new, something good. It's a huge reform. We have a deauthorization commission, but let's start them with the older projects. Let's track it. If we feel that we should move forward with more reform, I'm certainly open to it, and I would yield back and hope for a no vote on this amendment.
As for the yeas and nays.
Questions on the amendment? Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Blannett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johanns, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Mr. Coburn voted in the affirmative. Senators voting in the negative: Boxer, Carper, Cowan, Franken, Hagan, Heitkamp, Leahy, Merkley, Tester, and Wyden. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Johanns, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Fitter, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye.
What? Oh, I won the race. I'm so far ahead of you, you never saw me.
Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins? Aye.
How many people ran?
Mr. Cornyn?
No.
Aye.
People. Wow, where to start?
Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Toomey?
So this way.
Aye.
I'd have done it, but you know, hey, I didn't have the 20 minutes to take.
Mr. Crapo? Aye.
14-minute miles, that's not bad.
Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Robert?
I don't know if you will.
Mr. Robert? Aye. Mr. Schumer? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. King? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Manchin? No. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Pryor? No. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? No. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Corker. Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. Aye. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Aye.
That's your script after you announce.
Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Beckidge, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, no. Ms. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, Colorado, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Ms. Rono. Mr. Rono, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Brown, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Balkus? Mr. Balkus? No. Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? No. Mrs. Shaheen? No.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 43 and the nays 53, and the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to the amendment to number 816 offered by the senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn. The Senate will be in order. Yes, Senator from California.
Before we have the vote, I have
Senate will be in order.
I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. They've been approved by the majority of the minority leaders. I ask you see that these requests be agreed to, that these requests be printed in the record.
Are there any objections? Without objection. Senator from Oklahoma.
Pass the yeas and nays on my amendment 816.
Is there a sufficient second?
Madam President, under the rules, I believe that there's a minute, 2 minutes equally divided. Could I ask my friend if he wishes to make a statement on this?
I was going to just go on and...
Okay, well, I think the colleagues should hear the debate.
Okay.
I think so.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Amendment 816 expands the review commission so that, in fact, it can look at everything. We've given them a responsibility.
Not in order. This is an important amendment, and both sides need to be heard.
Senate will come to order.
What the bill does is a great first step, but it protects all earmarks from 1996 forward. So we're not going to look at any of those, and we're not going to allow the review commission, the deauthorizing commission, to make good recommendations on everything. We're going to select out what they can look at. If we trust them to look at the other things, we ought to trust them to look at all of it. And we have an opportunity to turn them down if, in fact, they're trying to deauthorize something that the Congress thinks shouldn't be deauthorized.
Madam President, I urge a no vote. Colleagues, please hear me out. This amendment would expand the authority of a newly created Infrastructure Deauthorization Commission and allow projects in your state to be stopped midstream. Active projects, projects that have local funds flowing into them, private funds flowing into them. This is a bridge too far. I am very proud of the work Senator Vitter and I have done in setting up this commission. We have very clear rules about what the commission could look at, and we protect projects that are active, and we say to them, go after the inactive projects and stop them and save taxpayer dollars. Please let's have a good no vote on this one. Thank you very much.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayat, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Crapo, Donnelly, Enzi, Blake, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, King, Kirk, McCaskill, Moran, Murphy, Hall, Roberts, Scott, Toomey, and Whitehouse. Mr. McCain, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Casey, Cochran, Cowan, Durbin, Fisher, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Kane, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Sessions, Shelby, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Vitter, Warren, and Wicker. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Schumer, no.
Aye.
Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? No. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? No. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? No. Mr. Bacchus? Mr. Bacchus?
Not quite.
No. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no.
When it comes to some...
Any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 35, the nays are 61, and the amendment is not agreed to. Senate will come to order.
So I think he's going.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to the amendment number 822, offered by the senator from Arkansas, Mr. Boozman.
The
Senate will be in order.
The senator deserves to be heard. If we could have order, please.
Senators, please take your conversations out of the chambers.
Madam President, before I turn to my colleague from Arkansas, I support his amendment, and I believe that he will be happy to have a voice vote. I hope that would be okay with everyone. I think it's a very good amendment, and I would ask him to explain it. If we could have order for him, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a very common sense amendment. All it does is allow the Corps of Engineers to participate in the Interagency America, the Beautiful Pass program. It just allows military families to participate in the same way that they already do with the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation.
Call up your amendment and answer this, and just call up your amendment.
Yeah, I'd like to call up my amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Arkansas, Mr. Boozman, proposes an amendment numbered 822.
Thank you again. Ditto. Again, this is a very common sense thing that I think that we would all agree to.
Who yields time in opposition?
All of our time, and we ask for a voice vote.
Without objection. If there's no further debate, the question is on Amendment 822. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Consider and lay it on the table.
Without objection. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number A66, offered by the senator from Oregon, Mr. Merkley.
Madam President, may we have order, please? We are moving along, but it just takes extra time. If we could just give our colleagues the respect they deserve. Every one of them deserves it. Madam President, I support the Merkley amendment. I hope we'll have an overwhelming vote on it, and I would ask my colleagues to take the remaining time.
Thank you, Madam President. I call up Amendment 866.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Oregon, Mr. Merkley, proposes an amendment numbered 866.
Thank you, Madam President. We have long recognized the principle that when taxpayers are paying for public infrastructure projects, it makes sense for American business, for the American economy, for our workers to do as much of the work as possible. Create that supply chain here in America. The Buy America rules we already have in the books have provided the foundation for millions of miles of roads, bridges, light rail, and subways, and millions of good-paying jobs. This amendment extends that concept with appropriate waivers for cost, for supply chain inadequacies, or for public interest. And with that, I turn this over to my colleague. It's a bipartisan amendment, and I ask for your support.
Madam President.
The Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I also strongly support the amendment. This is a common sense Buy America.
The Senate will be in order.
This is a common sense Buy America provision which is completely consistent with what we did on the recent highway bill in a bipartisan way, which created no controversy, no debate at conference. I support it.
Senator's time has expired. Who yields time in opposition? The Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I speak in opposition to this amendment. While I understand the concerns underlying it, I also have significant concerns with what this would do. In some circumstances, this could increase the cost of materials in some federal projects by close to 25%. So if we're talking about $1 billion worth of materials, we're talking about almost $250 million of increased cost for certain materials that this could bring about. Thank you, Madam President.
If there's no further debate, the question is on amendment number 866. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Bitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Coons, Cowan, Donnelly, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Heitkamp, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Roberts, Sanders, Schatz, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Whitehouse, Wyden. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Paul, Portman, Risch, Rubio, Scott, Thune, Toomey, Warner, Wicker. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Moran, no. Any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 60, the nays are 36, and the amendment is agreed to.
Madam President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, my amendment would sunset the so-called project acceleration provisions in 5 years. These provisions are untested. They were not subject of any hearings of our committee. They were added at the last minute before the markup, and they change what I think is the bedrock National Environmental Policy Act. They set arbitrary deadlines, rush decisions, lead to delays later, and mistakes in litigation. And haste may